Thank you for joining us this morning and welcome back to our third seminar in our Data and Evaluation series. I'm Ryan Souza, the Program Director for the CSAC Support Hub for Criminal Justice Programming. We are happy to have you back today. We know it is an extremely busy time and it's an unprecedented time and you have tons of things to do. So we're really happy you made it and we're really excited to have you here. There will be slides coming up, but I'm just going to go ahead and dive into them. We love to see that housekeeping slide, which just reminds us to make sure that we are keeping our microphones muted if you're not asking questions or responding to any questions. And then we'll also be actively monitoring any unintended noises. So if you see a quick note that says muted by host, don't worry or be offended. We're just jumping in to make sure that we don't hear anything you don't want us to. And then if it's a super interesting personal conversation, I guess maybe we'll let it play out for a minute and then add you as part of our Q&A topics for the first round. For any questions along the way, the chat feature is currently open to everyone, so please feel free to click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen if you are on the computer or phone, and feel free to ask any questions via chat or just jot down some notes for us so that we can make sure to cover those during the Q&A section. If others know the answer or if you're sending it to everyone, please feel free to weigh in. We want this to be an open forum, so your experiences or answers are really helpful in kind of starting the discussion. Alternatively to the chat, you can click on the reactions icon now on your Zoom, where you'll be able to raise your hand. If you have not updated your Zoom, which seems like it's happening every 5 minutes these days, the raise your hand feature is actually located in the participant icon. So if you click on the participant icon, down at the bottom of the list of participants, there should be a raised hand button in there, so you can use either of those. For those dialing in on the phone, you can hit *6 to mute or unmute yourself, and *9 to raise or lower your hand. And then I and a couple of others will be available with the chat function all along the way. So if you have any questions or problems or anything going on with the Zoom, feel free to let us know. We also have some planned Q&As as we move through the PowerPoint. Everything we're walking through today, including the PowerPoint and supplemental documents, are currently on our website, and which I'll also display in links in the chat as we move through the seminar here. And then finally, we'll upload the recorded portion of the seminar in the next couple of days, and so that will be available as well. Outside of our seminar series, just on our website, all of the seminars, recordings, and documents are available. And then it also, our website has additional efforts around the Support Hub, just highlighting some of the county work that's going on. Mia, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just a quick reminder, these entire series and each of these seminars is brought to you by the Support Hub for Criminal Justice Programming within CSAC. Through that hub, we designed what you're looking at right now before you, which is the strategic framework. We have covered this in depth a number of times, so I won't go too far in depth, but I just want to remind everybody that is on the call, as usual, that this really creates an umbrella for everybody. And it's guided by not only the seminar series that we're putting on, the work that's being developed around it, and then technical assistance as well. I'm going to just briefly walk through each of these. It's really just an oversimplified way of saying how as a county can you start to make better and more informed data-driven and evidence-based decisions in your county programs, and where do we have the time to engage in each of these. It's one of the reasons we created the seminar series is to give you exposure to each and every single one of these, give you next steps to use on each of these, and then also offer technical assistance that many of you are teamed up with our consultants on to really dive into some areas where you have time. So the first up is program inventory and literature review. We've gone through this, but it's really how do you build a solid base for your foundation of programs? How do you look at programs you have and really match them to evidence? The next step in the process is logic models and process maps. Really, how do you start to outline what you're aiming to achieve from those, and how do you start thinking about developing programs and monitoring them in a way that's meaningful so that you actually start heading towards those outcomes that you're aiming for? The middle step of the inventory is contracting practices. In the first couple of seminars, you start to think about how you build a program. You start to think about how you're tracking it, what kind of data you're looking at, how to start engaging with providers. And that middle piece is really important. And how do you start putting it together? How do you engage with providers, put it into an RFP or an IFB, start talking about how you're going to actually achieve these contracting, and then ultimately get accountability and fidelity around it, so that everything you've done up front is now put into writing or put into some form of documentation, so you can start tracking to it as we get to these last couple of steps in the framework. The fourth step there that you see is data strategy and dashboards, and I'm going to loop in program evaluation on it. This is why you're here today. It's the second seminar series around data strategy and evaluation. Really, it's the culmination of all the work that you've either done just naturally without even involving the framework, but really, how do you start to think about data? How do you start putting it together in a meaningful way? All the data sources that exist out there, how do you start thinking about integrating those and using them in a really meaningful and powerful way? And that's what this series is really about. And so that really helps strategize and get you there. And this is what the data strategies and dashboards does. In terms of program evaluation and cost benefit analysis, these two final steps, and some of you have done some of this already, really just get you to an end game. Everything you've done and engaged with us on, anything you've done outside of the hub, really it comes down to how do you start proving it? How do you start showing it? How do you ultimately stand and say our programs are working? Or even if they're potentially not working the way we wanted them to, we now are educated in why they're not working, and we can go back and start to tweak those. And so the program evaluation and cost benefit analysis really just give you all of that information at your fingertips to really leverage everything you've done and really put you on a final path to say, look, I took all the right steps and now we're here and we can actually talk about what's happening and the outcomes of these programs. So that's our strategic framework in a nutshell. And I think just as you start to think about all the seminar series, if you find places you want to engage or think about potential, just even slight places you want to improve practices in your counties, we're here to help along the way. Mia, will you jump to the next slide for me, please? Okay, I'm going to take one step back here today and talk about what we did in the previous seminar for the data and evaluation series. So in January, I know it feels like months ago already for everybody that is working 24 hours a day, I'm sure. We talked about accessing state data. There was a detailed discussion on what kind of data exists in CDCR and within the DOJ, and kind of how can you start to use that to think about really creating a holistic picture of data so that when you come to those outcome evaluations or when you start building dashboards that are meaningful to your operations, you can start to think about this really robust data set to give you the full picture of what you're doing. So now as we step forward and we say, okay, whether you're using localized data or whether you have access to CDCR and DOJ data, how do you start to integrate those conversations so that you can think about the best way to present this information, which is complex. It can often be sometimes daunting if you aren't sure what you're doing, but that's why we're here today, is to really help you start stepping through that process and give you definitive steps on where integration becomes really critical and how you can actually take steps to do that. This conversation, I think today is going to be pretty detailed in terms of some of the people that are thinking about starting to integrate county and state data. From a leadership perspective or from somebody that's just on the external side of it that hasn't been in the weeds, I think it's still really meaningful to start thinking about this because we will be providing some use cases today. We'll be providing kind of the why you approach these things. And that is really helpful for you to start talking about outside of it or to guide the teams in why they might want to take such an effort and to start thinking about consistency in the county. As a leader, you often want data and you want to look at data, but there's so much that goes behind it. It's really helpful to kind of understand how that was developed and just start creating some meaningful consistency in terms of your conversations across the board. So I'm going to shut up. I'm 12 minutes in. That was my speed version of this. And I'm going to put it over to Mia Bird, who is going to walk us through the seminar today. And we'll be available for chat questions, and I'll be uploading those links in just a second. Mia?
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be with you here today. As Ryan said, today we're diving into Data Strategy Part 3. And I just want to congratulate those of you who have been with us along the way, because these first 3 seminars are pretty detailed and in the weeds on how you get your data house in order, how you create the data infrastructure that you will then draw on and use to do lots of cool things. And some of those cool things we'll talk about in the seminar, but there's certainly a lot of other cool things you can do with that data infrastructure. Many of you have worked with Kevin and Mike to do things like recidivism tools, to do other cool things with your data. And so thank you for sticking with us through the really hard in the weeds part of creating that data infrastructure. I hope that in our next seminar, it'll start to get a little bit more fun when we start using that data infrastructure. But that's my way of saying today is going to be a little hard, I think, in my opinion, because we are going to go through in a process-oriented way, sort of how you integrate county and state data. And so the way that I've set this up is that we're going to do this in two parts. We're going to start by thinking about how do you integrate county data with DOJ data. And the DOJ data is quite complex. So this first part of the seminar today is going to be a little bit longer and a little bit more complicated. And I think that's a good setup because when we are more tired and we're moving into the second half, it'll go a little bit more quickly because often the data you receive from CDCR will be less complicated to work with. And so for each of these, for the county DOJ data linking, we're going to use an example of linking jail data to DOJ data so that you can do some pretrial analysis. And there are certainly many reasons why you would link jail data to DOJ data, including recidivism analysis. You might link DOJ data to probation data. So there's all different ways of linking and all different purposes. And so we're going to give some general guidance here on how you prepare that jail data and that DOJ data to be linked. And then just give an example of how you might link it if you wanted to do something like a pretrial analysis. And then the second half, we're going to look at how you would link county data to CDCR data through the use case of linking probation data with CDCR data on PRCS releases, and really for the purpose of better understanding, getting more information about the characteristics of the PRCS population. So that's our setup. I'm going to dive in. I did want to mention, as Ryan said, there's lots of ways to ask questions. If this seminar will probably serve as a reference, it might be something that you go back to over time when you're actually working with these data. We have lots of documents that can be good references, but if you're able to kind of follow along with us today and jump in, especially if you have any clarifying questions, being here all together is such a good opportunity to get those questions answered in real time. So if you have a clarifying question, please feel free to jump into the chat or raise your hand or speak up as we go. And then as Ryan said, we'll be pausing for questions as well. So part one, linking jail data with DOJ data. So first I'm going to walk you through just 5 steps for how I typically prepare jail data for linking. There are many ways to do this. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong way, but these are the 5 steps and they're in an important order for me that really work well for me. And so this is really a conversation about what's the process you go through when you're preparing that jail data and sort of why you might go through that process. And so the first step is to select and clean the data elements within your jail data. Then to consolidate your booking and release types, if that's something that's helpful. To clean the offense codes you have and to use the seriousness hierarchy that DOJ has created to create a hierarchy from most serious to least serious offense. Then to construct some indicators that really represent that booking, and then to collapse to that booking event level. So I'm going to walk you through each of these steps in a little bit more detail. So when we select and clean key data elements, this is just a process of thinking about, what are the really important data elements that are in our jail data system? And, it really varies by county what's included in these data systems, but some of them have a ton of information and it can be a lot to deal with when you're working with complex data. And so one of the first steps I usually take is to say, well, what do I really need from the system? And either to extract only those variables or to limit the data set I'm working with to include those variables. And then from there, and just to highlight for this purpose, and I think often for many purposes, these are some of the key variables that we're often wanting to pull out of that jail system. So some identifiers so that we can link, some demographic information, some information on the booking, what's the number that tracks it, what was the date, the type of booking, which we'll get to in a moment, the offense and the charge level for each offense, each booking offense. And so as you can see already, you're going to have in your data multiple rows for any booking that has more than one offense associated with it, right? So we've got a data set that is organized by bookings, but could have multiple rows per booking. And then also often it's important to include that release date and type as well. And it's helpful to pre-clean this data. And what I think of as pre-cleaning is just resolving any mismatching information. So we're really trying to link across individuals within different data sets. And so it's really important to think about, do we have the same information for everyone that we think is the same individual? And the jail data often allows you to take multiple observations. Unfortunately, people have been booked many times into jail over a period of time to resolve any mismatching information. And the one I see this most often is in date of birth. So sometimes we think we have the same individual, they have a lot of the same characteristics, but one of the dates of birth might be off. And that's something that's going to pose complications later on if we don't resolve that before linking. So the second step in this process is really to think about how you want to consolidate booking and release types. And this can really apply to any variables that are coded in your data set, but most commonly I see in jail systems that some have a small set of booking or release types, but some have many, many different categories. And these categories give us all this richness, like we're able to understand so much better someone's path through the jail system because of this richness, but it also becomes complex when we're working with the data. And so thinking through what are the higher level booking and release types that I really need to have, and can I consolidate, if you are working in a jail system that has many, many different codes for booking and release type, can I consolidate into a list that's meaningful for me? That's just going to help you down the road. And so these are some suggestions of ways that I might consolidate. You could certainly do it differently. There's really no one right way to do this. So this third step is thinking about how can I understand this booking? How can I represent this booking? There's so much information, and often there are so many multiple booking types and also many different booking charges or charges associated with the booking. And so how do I begin to work towards representing this booking? And one way that we often do that is to think about, well, what's the most serious charge associated with this booking? And can we use that charge to sort of represent the overall booking? And so one way that we do that is that we clean the booking offenses using law enforcement code tables. I'm going to see if I can show you what that looks like. So if you go to this link that you see in the slide, you'll come to this website from DOJ, and they give us a lot of different offense codes in a lot of different forms. And we can use those offense codes to clean some of our data. And what I mean by clean is that sometimes we have offense codes in our data that are not actually reflective of real offenses. And that can happen for a number of reasons, including just errors in data entry, but it can also happen because there are some local codes that don't exist for DOJ. And the challenge there, and I'm going to show you a document that is part of your materials. So this document is created just from, it's a summary document of some of those law enforcement tables, and it includes a number of the variables that you might need in order to arrive at that seriousness hierarchy. And that seriousness hierarchy, you can see it starts low for very serious crimes and it gets higher for less serious crimes. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, something to keep in mind.
And Mia,
yes.
we're only seeing your slides. The other things you're trying to share aren't coming up.
Thank you, Michael. Hold on one second.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's try this again. Sorry, everyone, that's very confusing. So this is the document that's attached in the materials. This is a document that just summarizes some of the information that you would need to go from the penal code that you have in your data system to the seriousness level in the DOJ seriousness hierarchy. And what I was just showing you is you can see that these more serious offenses actually have lower.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you zoom in on that? Is that possible?
Oh,
It's small.
sure. Let me see here. And this is also something that you can link to through the Hub website right now, if that's helpful to you to look at your own version. How's that?
Yeah.
Great. And so what you're seeing here for the third time, sorry about that, everyone, is that you have the penal codes or offense codes if they're not actual penal codes. And then you have a seriousness hierarchy that's matched to those penal codes. And there are a number of other variables that can translate between penal code and the seriousness hierarchy that are over here as well. And so what this document does is it helps you to use this seriousness hierarchy that DOJ creates to attach a seriousness level to each of the offenses in your jail data. And I'm just going to show you that website that you missed when you could only see my slides. This is the website that you link to in that slide. And this is where the information is held that went into this table that I created for you, just to make it a little bit simpler to access that information. But you can always go to the website source. So I'm going to come back to the slides and I'm going to walk through that one more time. So what we're up to here in this third step is we're really trying to find a way to characterize our booking. And one way to do that is to characterize it based on the most serious offense. And so what we're doing here is we're just getting ready to be able to do that. And so what we do is we take those codes, those offense codes that are in our jail data associated with the booking, and we attach a seriousness level to each of those offenses so that we understand how they compare in terms of their seriousness level. Any questions before we jump forward?
Hey, Mia, it's Karen Baker.
Hi, Karen.
Would you recommend that once that's established, that it get updated once a year?
You're right. Some of these associations will change over time. And so are you thinking once a year, sort of redoing it based on checking the hierarchy, or just on the new offenses that have come in during the last year?
Yeah, just because there's so much legislation that happens every year that tends to impact probation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea to think about sort of systematically updating it. Once you've done it the first time, you're in such good shape to be able to make small changes over time, but it is a pretty big lift the first time you do it. Okay, so step 4, we're almost through preparing your jail data. Step 4 is then to create some indicators that you think are important to have about that booking. So what's important in that booking information? And so some of the things that we often would create are indicators for the booking and release type, maybe indicators for whether it's a person, property, drug, or other offense, indicators for whether within that booking there is a serious offense, a violent offense, a sexual offense, or a DV offense. And also maybe the total number of charges that are within that booking, the total number of felony charges or misdemeanor charges. And this is a list that provides some guidance, but really it's what's important to you to know about that booking to characterize it well. And then finally, we've taken some of these steps, especially the last 2 steps, because we're ultimately going to collapse this file. And by collapse the file, we mean make it a flat file, or in other words, make it a file that has one row for every booking event. And so that's why we've sort of attached a seriousness. We want to sort the file so that we have that most serious offense at the top. And then we want to have all those indicators that tell us what we would like to know about that booking before we go ahead and we collapse it and we essentially make it a simpler file to work with. So we're going to move into preparing that DOJ data, and preparing the DOJ data is going to have 5 steps that are quite similar to the steps for the jail data. But any questions or comments before we jump into that section? Okay. So similar setup here. we're now thinking about, you're going to receive these files, you go through the whole process of requesting, making an application and requesting the data, and then you receive it from DOJ. And it's a really big data file. It's going to contain the whole criminal history for all of the individuals that you requested data for. So depending on the period of time you're looking at, this could be a lot of individuals with a lot of prior arrests and convictions. And so you're going to get this big data file, and then I'm going to walk you through here kind of how I began to work with that data and prepare it to be linked to local data. So the first thing I typically do, and I'm going to show you this in more detail, because I'm interested in cycles that start with arrest usually, and I'm going to show you some of the other types of events that might be in that data, I select the arrest events. And then from there, I look at all the different court actions. And if I'm trying to build criminal history, I'm usually focused on conviction dispositions. So we can start to simplify this file by selecting out just the arrest events, and then among the court actions, selecting the conviction dispositions. These are just two simplifying steps to help us to manage this file. And then step 3, we do something very similar to step 3 with the jail data. We clean those offense codes, and you might not be surprised by this, but DOJ offense codes also typically need some cleaning. And then we attach that seriousness hierarchy, which typically is not attached to the data that comes from DOJ. So we're doing a very similar thing here as we did with the jail data. And then similarly, again, we construct indicators. And with the DOJ data, it's organized by cycles that start with a particular event and then have a sequence of actions that follow that event. So it's organized into a cycle that you might think of as a case. And so we're constructing, well, with the jail data, we constructed indicators based on the booking to represent the booking. With the DOJ criminal history data, we're constructing indicators to represent that cycle. And then finally, just like with the jail data, we're going to collapse to that cycle level so that we have a flat file that's going to be easier to work with when we link. So selecting arrest events just means looking at that initial event in a cycle and selecting out those that begin with an arrest. And an arrest will have, much like a booking, it will have an offense or multiple charges, offense charges associated with it. And we're going to see in this data that there's an ID that connects all the different steps within that cycle. And cycles, as I said, may begin with an arrest event, but they may begin with other types of events. And I hope I don't screw this up, I'm going to show you a little flow chart to help understand this. Can you all see this Excel file?
You've got it, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So this Excel file is also in our materials for today. It's linked on the CSAC website for this seminar. And you can see what this is granted a fairly rudimentary, at my skill level, a depiction of the different types of events that you might see in the DOJ data. And then for each of these events, it shows you what subsequent steps you might see in that data that are associated with the cycle. And so what I'm suggesting is that typically we're interested in the arrest events, and we're not necessarily as interested in these other events when we're constructing criminal history. For other purposes, if you have a different purpose, you might be interested in these other events. And within these arrest events, we may have some activities happening post-arrest, and then some, if it makes it to this stage, some court actions. And within those court actions, we're going to be looking at convictions. So we're going to come back to this in just a minute when we talk about conviction dispositions. Okay, so what I was, just to go over it briefly one more time, on this left-hand side, you have the different events that can start off a cycle within the DOJ data. And what we're talking about is selecting these arrest events and then thinking about, what are the different steps that can occur in an arrest event cycle. And you can see going through here that it may end with sentence time if the arrest results in a conviction and a sentence. So we'll come back to this in just a minute. We're still on step 1 of the DOJ process. And so we've talked about selecting those arrest events starting from that point in time. And those arrest events are going to create one really key component of criminal history. And so we're going to work to simplify those arrest events as we go, but just know that we're starting off with arrest events. And then we're focusing on convictions, and convictions are that other key component of criminal history. And of course, you may be interested in other things like revocations, for example, but focusing on getting that conviction data in this use case. And so, as I said, some cycles begin with an arrest event. And once you select those arrest events, you can look at those subsequent steps or those court actions to see which arrest actually resulted in convictions. And so similarly, there can be convictions on multiple offenses in that data. So we want to characterize, we're going to want to characterize both the arrest and the conviction in this process. And so for the purposes of building this criminal history, once we have the arrests and the convictions, we're in pretty good shape. And as I said, you can also look at revocation dispositions if that's of interest. Okay. So that we talked about that first page of the flow chart, and then you can go to the second page. And this is probably a little hard to see if it was too small before, but you can open this up for yourself if you want to from the CSAC hub page. So what you have here is quite a detailed review or flow chart of what you might find in the DOJ data. And so you're going to find that initial arrest starting off the cycle. And then you may find steps that include, and those folks that work in operations, this is quite obvious to you, might include any number of actions that could happen following an arrest. And if that arrest moves forward to a court to have an actual court action, then there's a set of potential steps that could occur after that initial court action. And it's organized in this way where we think of all of these things as court actions, but each one has different characteristics. And so within that category of court actions, you might find any number of these things. So acquittals or exonerations, bench warrants, commitments, convictions, and this is the one that we're really focused on for creating criminal history. But all of these track sort of what happens in that case, and there's going to be a sequence of information tracking all of these different possibilities. And then information on sentencing as well. So what happens following a conviction? Well, perhaps a sentence to jail or prison or any number of things. So we just kind of summarized how you might use those DOJ flowcharts that are in your materials to think about setting up your arrest events and then selecting just the conviction events if that's what's of interest for creating criminal history. And then I said step 3 here is really similar to the jail data. So we're cleaning those offense codes and we're attaching that hierarchy. And so I won't go into this in detail because it is so similar, but again, you're using those law enforcement code tables, or you can use the offense codes Excel file that I created as a summary of that information. And importantly, that seriousness level that you're attaching is going to allow you to characterize the arrest history and the conviction history based on that most serious charge. And then in a similar way, you're constructing some indicators. What do you want to know about that arrest and conviction history? And you may not need to know very much. You may just be interested in, how many arrests and what were the charge levels, and how many convictions and what were the charge levels. But you might be interested in some more detailed information, such as the offense category, whether it was person, property, drug, or other, how many person offenses, for example, did this individual have in their history? Or indicators of serious, violent, sexual, or DV offenses in their history. And you might, again, want to summarize, as with the bookings, what are the total number of charges by charge level or offense category within that cycle. So total number for arrest or total number for conviction. And so you can kind of choose how many indicators you create based on the level of detail you want about the criminal history. And then finally, as with the bookings, it's very helpful to collapse this data at the cycle level. And that means that we have one observation or one row for each cycle, each court cycle. And that each of those cycles begin with an arrest. Some of them will result in a conviction and some of them will not. And as with the booking data, prior to collapsing and flattening that file to one row per cycle, it's helpful to sort it so that we're retaining the charge information for the most serious arrest and the most serious conviction. So I'm going to give an example of how you would then, now that you've prepared your jail file and you've prepared your DOJ file, how you would then integrate them or link them in order to do a pretrial analysis. But before I jump to that, we're going to have some questions after. Are there any questions about what I've said about preparing the DOJ data? So we thought giving a concrete use example would be helpful to get a handle on sort of why we might do this and what we might use it for. But it's also helpful because the way that you would prepare and integrate your data is going to depend on what you want to do with it, of course. And so, as I said, there's no right way to do this, but if we were thinking about integrating DOJ and jail data so that we could do some analysis of pretrial release. So one of the questions we might have is, what are the criminal history characteristics of people who are released versus detained, or released on different types of releases versus those who are detained? So we might want to better understand our pretrial release decisions in the context of criminal history. That's just one of many questions we could ask in a pretrial analysis. So in order to do something like that, we would take our DOJ data, it's been collapsed at that cycle level, and it's starting with an arrest event. And we would take our jail booking data, which has also been collapsed at the booking level and is starting with a booking date of that event. And so we would use that individual identifier and those dates to integrate or to link the data so that we could identify the DOJ records associated with that booking. And not all DOJ arrests are going to be associated with a booking. It's important to note that some arrests that appear in the DOJ data do not result in a jail booking, but most do. And so there should be a relationship there where you're finding the DOJ information for an individual who has been booked into jail. And so from there, if we wanted to focus on a pretrial analysis, we would then use that DOJ information along with the information in our jail data to identify those jail spells that are pretrial spells. And that might mean they're booked into jail, they're released pretrial, or it might mean they're booked into jail and they're detained through the resolution of their case. But the DOJ data gives us really rich information about all the subsequent court actions and the resolution of that case. So it's really helpful in separating pretrial spells from other types of jail spells, really tracking the individual's movement through their trajectory. So we would go ahead and link that together for the period of interest, and then decide, what are those pretrial spells we want to focus on? Do we only want the most recent pretrial spell for each individual? Do we want to include all the pretrial spells of every individual in our data set? So we would make some decisions about how we're going to structure that analysis. And then from there, we have sort of the pretrial spells, or the point in time at which someone was booked into jail. And what that gives us is really valuable information in differentiating between what is criminal history in that analysis and what are future outcomes, such as pretrial misconduct or recidivism outcomes, because it's that point in time associated with that pretrial booking that becomes the dividing line. And so from there, we can look at all the other DOJ data for that individual, and we can say, okay, this data is the criminal history for that individual. And then we begin to have indicators. We can construct indicators of the number of prior arrests, the number of prior convictions, the type of prior arrests, and the type of prior convictions. So really start to fill out what was the criminal history of that individual when they were booked into jail and the pretrial decision was made. So you really stuck with me there. Thank you all for moving through a lot of complex content. That's a large share of what we have for today. We're going to move into probation and CDCR data in a moment, but I wanted to first invite Mike, who has done some pretrial analysis using local data, to offer any thoughts or comments he might have on that work, and then also to open it up for any questions or comments you have.
Sure. Yep. Thank you, Mia. And I honestly, I don't have a lot to add. I think you covered that very well, Mia, of the importance of and the difficulty of trying to tease out what time someone's in jail. Is that pretrial or is it post-disposition? So I've done this work in a number of counties, and some counties collect that data very well, and you can rely on the jail data itself to determine the pretrial phase. Other counties don't collect that data as well, and so supplementing that with the DOJ data allows you to, one, as Mia said, determine which period is pretrial versus which is post-disposition, but it also allows you to pull in criminal history that's not just related to criminal history in your county, but criminal history in other areas as well, so that you can get a better idea of things like, if you don't have a risk tool that you're already using, you can get an idea of how risky those individuals are based on prior arrests, number of prior arrests, types of prior arrests, time to, age at, those sorts of things that are all correlated to risk. That data is also wonderful to use for follow-up. So if you're not just looking at time while they're on pretrial, but looking at did they fail in terms of getting a new arrest, then ultimately new convictions, even after that case is closed, if you can use that DOJ data looking forward as well to see not only what happened in your county, but what happened elsewhere. So I just want to echo what you said, Mia. I agree completely that data is can definitely be used on both ends, on the front end to figure out who was pretrial, what their criminal history looks like, as well as looking at the outcomes of those who are on pretrial of, did they fail, and did they fail outside the county in terms of getting picked up for a new warrant, or also looking at arrest and on through conviction. So I don't know if there's other questions. I know you had turned this over for questions, and I jumped right in there, but are there questions that folks have? I see something in the chat. I haven't read that yet, but you can raise your hand. Any questions that anyone has would now be a great time for those.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if any of you have done this work before and you'd want to share your experience or challenges or strategies, that would be super helpful, I think, to this group as well.
Not seeing any hands. Any takers on sharing experiences? I know this can be a new adventure for a lot of people. Okay. Seeing that, Mia, do you want to jump into the?
Yep, I'll jump into the next section.
All right, cool.
All right. So now we're diving into another case, linking probation data with CDCR data. And as I mentioned, you could certainly link probation data with DOJ data, and especially to understand recidivism outcomes or the criminal history of the probation population. So there's certainly value in doing that. We just happen to select these two examples for demonstration. So preparing that probation data, I usually approach it in these 4 steps. Again, there are many ways to do it, but and probation data systems do vary quite a bit. So you'll have to think about, how do these steps fit with the way that your probation data is structured. So what I've most often encountered, based on what I've most often encountered in probation data, I start with just selecting and cleaning those data elements, just as we did within the jail data. And then thinking about what is the supervision type hierarchy. And we'll talk a bit more about that. It's just thinking about, if people do have overlapping terms, how are we going to organize them, or how are we going to characterize them? And then third, constructing those indicators that represent that probation spell that we think are going to be important to keep in the analysis. And then finally, for those that do have overlapping supervision events, kind of how do we collapse that data so that we have a more flat file for linking? So selecting and cleaning data elements, there's often a lot of data in probation systems. It might also be the case that data is held within different systems that are owned by probation. And so thinking about, well, which of those data systems do you need to access to get the data elements that you need? And how are you going to be able to bring those together? And so typically what we're looking for is those identifiers and those demographics, and really making sure when we talk about cleaning the data, making sure that when we have multiple observations in that probation data that we think are the same person, that we've cleaned up any differences in their characteristics. And those could be errors in their identification numbers, could be errors in their dates of birth, or errors in their race, ethnicity, or gender, that all of that is cleaned up to the extent we can. And again, this is for research purposes, so there's not as much pressure as when we're thinking about operational purposes on making absolutely sure that we have the same individual. We do our very best, but we want to kind of clean up that data so that it's consistent. If you have somebody with the same CI&I and the same local ID, they also in every observation in your data have the same date of birth, gender, and race and ethnicity. And so we might also be interested in commonly supervision start type and date. And by start type, it might mean sort of the term that they're starting. It could also mean information about whether it's a new start or they're returning to supervision after, say, a jail stay or something of that nature. And then the date is really important here. And similarly, in some systems, you're able to access the end type. How did they end supervision? Was it that they were revoked, or was it that they completed successfully, or some other end type, and the date at which they ended supervision? And then less commonly, you'll be able to integrate information like risk and needs assessments, program and service interventions, and violations and sanctions. We're hoping over time to expand the ability to integrate this information into probation departments, but everybody's in a different place in terms of being able to access these data. And so then, as I mentioned, and this is really a small issue and very straightforward relative to trying to connect that seriousness hierarchy that we talked about in the last section. But really, for those individuals that have overlapping terms, how would you like to create a hierarchy? And the hierarchy that I commonly come in as a researcher is thinking about, well, what might be the most serious type of supervision, or what might be the most serious population that's under supervision. So I tend to focus on sort of PRCS being higher in that hierarchy than the mandatory supervision group, than the felony probation. And then if you have misdemeanor probation, then that group as well. And so, but this may not be the right way for your department to organize these terms. And so thinking about, if an individual is serving multiple terms, how do we want to characterize that individual in our data? And then much like in the other section, we want to construct the indicators around that supervision spell. So what do we want to know about that supervision spell? And this can happen because we have sort of multiple observations within our probation data. It can also mean pulling data from other systems and attaching it to that probation spell. And so some of the things we might be interested in, for each of those supervision starts, what are the types? What are the risk and needs assessments? What kinds of programs or services, violations or sanctions? Similarly, for the end type, kind of indicators for the different end types that might be in that data. And then additionally, if you do have an overlapping supervision term and you're planning to characterize the supervision term as, say, a PRCS, you might want to create an indicator that tells you that that person was also on felony probation or finishing a felony probation term. And then collapsing to the event level. So really getting that probation data so that everything that you really want to know about that supervision spell is included in just one observation or one row of the data, and figuring out how you want to characterize that probation spell or that probation term. So I know this is a welcome slide. I'm only proposing 2 steps for preparing that CDCR data for integration. Selecting the key elements from the data file you receive from CDCR, and then selecting the focal release. And here we're thinking about that CDCR data coming as a release file. So all the individuals that were released from CDCR to your county. So the nice thing about CDCR relative to DOJ is that they are often able to provide a summary level data file that includes a number of indicators. And what this means is that you don't have to work with the data in ways that allow you to construct these indicators as we've had to do with the DOJ data. Instead, they will be typically available in summary form. In some cases, you may receive multiple files from CDCR with these summary level data, and you may have to integrate those files based on the individual ID and the release date. But that's less common. I've definitely done that before, but I've also received summary level data. And so the hope is that they would provide one file with summary data that you could use. And so that's kind of the process we present here, because I think that's what's most likely to happen. And so depending what you've requested from CDCR in that application, you could get any number of data elements. I think these are the most commonly asked for. So what is that current offense that the individual was released on, and what type of offense was that? What about, and the nice thing again is that CDCR creates these summary variables. How many prior violent or serious offenses did that individual have at the time of release? How many prior prison terms and how many prior returns to prison? What was the prison length of stay prior to that release? Are there any indicators of behavioral health needs, such as mental health needs or substance use needs? And what is their California static risk assessment level? You know, are they high risk for a person offense, high risk for a property or drug offense, or moderate or low risk? CDCR also has information on, you know, their COMPASS assessments of risks and needs and in custody programmatic interventions. And that data is provided less often, and it may require more work to construct sort of summary level indicators if that data is of interest. And then second, individuals under PRCS supervision may have had multiple stays in CDCR in their prison history. So you will be receiving data for all of those stays. And one of the decisions you'll be making is, are we interested in using that data from CDCR to give us more information about the characteristics of the most recently released PRCS population? So some of those individuals are probably still under PRCS supervision. Or are we interested in characterizing the entire history of the PRCS population in the county? So what have been the characteristics, say, beginning in 2011 and over time? And that helps you to figure out whether you want to select the most recent release for every individual in that data, or you'd like to keep all the releases in that data for every individual released on PRCS in every instance that they were released. And that's just a question about your purpose or what you'd like to produce. So here we just walk through some of the steps you would take once you've prepared that probation data to be linked and you have that CDCR data ready to be linked. You are going to identify those PRCS, and again, this is for the purpose of understanding the characteristics of the PRCS population. You're going to identify those PRCS spells, so you're going to select those, and then you're going to use those to match to CDCR release date to those spells based on the CII number and the release date from CDCR and the start date from probation. And as many of you are probably thinking, this might not be so simple because someone doesn't necessarily show up to start probation on the exact date they're released from CDCR. In some cases, probation departments start working with folks before they leave CDCR. And so it's possible the start date could be prior to release. And in some cases, there's a delay in that individual starting probation supervision after release. And so my suggestion is to look for the closest release date, but to put some limit on the amount of time that there can be between release and start date of probation, and maybe to flag those cases for more investigation that have long periods between the release and the start date. And then your resulting file, when you link based on that identifier and those dates, will be a file that has a richer set of information about your PRCS population. So it has what you know about them from probation, but also what CDCR knows about them and are in their data system. So we're gonna pause here and see if there are any thoughts or any questions. If anyone has experience, and I invite Kevin, Mike, and Ryan to jump in as well, but anyone in our group has experience or questions about how to do this kind of work. And this can be with the CDCR probation case, and it can also be with the earlier case we discussed with jail and DOJ data. So just any open questions about what we've covered in this seminar.
Not seeing any hands, not seeing any comments. Okay. All right. Not seeing any hands, not seeing any questions. I know this was, it's a lot to take in, especially for those that maybe aren't doing in-depth, detailed work on the data files, but know that this recording is available and the PowerPoint's available as well. And so you can always reach back out. And the joy of all of this is the team with pictures before you today, Mike, Kevin, and Mia, are here to help walk through some of this. And really guide you as you kind of start to think about how to structure this. And it will really be helpful as you start to think about the next series, the next seminars that we're holding, when you start thinking about data dashboards and really program evaluations and how you can really start to use all this information in a really consistent way. Thank you for that comment, Karen. I am also grateful these are being recorded. There's so much detail here that's just, it's really incredible to be able to go back and watch it. Mia, is there anything else?
Yeah, I think I'll just share the wrap-up slides we have. And, after walking through the last couple wrap-up slides, oh, Denise, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I just, well, first of all, Mia, thank you so much for this. As you know, Contra Costa has been working to obtain the DOJ data, the CDCR data. We have our probation data and our court data, and it is a daunting task to just try to wrap my head around all of the data, as well as all of the possibilities surrounding what we can do with it. And I appreciate very much your models and slides. For me, as a visual learner, makes it really clear about what the components are. But I also really appreciate the use cases that you have laid out. And I wonder if you and the team have any more documents that speak about the different kind of use cases, so that we could maybe draw from those based upon our local priorities. It really makes it so much easier to wrap your head around this, and just because of the sheer quantity of the data and the possibilities. So, but primarily I want to say thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Oh, Denise, thank you for all the work that you all are doing in Contra Costa to try to just move this forward. It's so brave. I love the idea of creating some more use cases, and I think that's definitely something that we don't have them, but I think we can create them. Just some common ways that you might want to integrate and use these data. And we can definitely do that and create some documentation in advance of the next seminar. And then in the next seminar, we're going to be talking about use cases to create your dashboards. So what kinds of things might you want to bring together in a descriptive data dashboard so that you can drill down and look at the relationships between different things. And then in the final seminar, we'll be focusing on sort of the use case of doing program evaluation or any kind of intervention that you want to evaluate. But I love that idea, Denise. I'll try to put together just maybe 5 or 10 sort of one-pagers on sort of how you might and why you might integrate data for particular purposes. And if folks have ideas, I would love to hear them. You can send them through Ryan, right, Ryan? So if there's questions you're trying to answer or ways you'd like to use the data, but you'd like to see it kind of spelled out how you might go about doing that, where you might get the data elements you need and how you might put them together, we would love to hear that from you and sort of produce some documentation on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Mia. Mia said it just now, but also know that we're here, even if you just want to dabble in brainstorming and you have some ideas, or you say, I'm really just not even sure where to go, but this is something I'm interested in. We are here to really be helpful in any way we can be. So definitely forward those on, and we're here to connect with you. Okay.
I was going to share our wrap-up slides. Should I do that, Ryan? And then, while we're walking through these last couple of slides, we do have some time. So if any questions formulate in that process, we'll pause again when we come back to just address anything that's come up. Ryan, do you want to walk through these last few slides?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
You did all the difficult stuff and the juggling, so I can take the summary link here. Mia, sorry, excuse me. In the chat, we have the PowerPoint that's linked, but we also have our website. So these documents are up on our website as well. They're also linked in the PowerPoint here. So you have the DOJ law enforcement code tables that Mia displayed up front in the first part of it. We have the DOJ offense codes, the flow charts that are describing kind of how the data flows and some of the structure around that. And then a link to the penal code structure as well, if you want to do some actual diving into the actual law itself. And then you have 2 links here at the final part, which is just, again, our series info and the website, which are also in the chat. So definitely click on one of those links and just save them as a favorite so you can get back to all this stuff. And even if you forget all of it, you can always shoot me an email or call me anytime, and I'll be able to connect you with all the documents.
Hey, Ryan, I'm realizing something I failed to mention. I linked you to the penal code because sometimes when we have codes that seem to have an error, they don't match to any penal code. It's helpful to go digging in the penal code to try to figure out what this probably is. And that's some of that manual cleanup. And I forgot to mention that earlier.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So as we look ahead, just for the April series, we are going to be taking this hat off and putting our programming seminar series hat back on. We're going to be talking about the first components around the cost benefit model, really start to look at how you develop and look at analyzing those cost benefits, those drivers, around how outcomes, recidivism, and really just resources are ultimately used at the county. And it really starts to, like I said, create the culmination of all the work that you've done in terms of the program inventory and some of the matching to evidence and looking at initial recidivism. So that's going to be coming up in April, and it's just the first part of our cost benefit. And then in May, we are going to, as Mia has mentioned a couple of times, start to discuss data dashboards, use cases around how to design dashboards, really look at key population characteristics, interventions and outcomes that are going to be really important to you operationally, and then discuss some concepts around how to build those. Mia, did you want to add anything on the May piece? Are we okay?
Nope, that sounds great.
Okay. And then the last slide is just my contact information as usual. That is my mobile number, so feel free to text me with any questions or reach out, just absolutely anything. The support hub, again, is literally here to assist you in anything that you can think of around this wide umbrella of the framework, everything from the programming series all the way down to just brainstorming on how to start developing your data infrastructure. And so I'm going to stop for a second and just open it up for any final questions or comments or anything that would really kind of is on the tip of your tongue or in your mind that you want to share, and see if we can just finalize some initial conversation here.
This is Kevin. I'll just kind of add in kind of like the reason kind of the details matter here is I think because our next couple of seminars really are about kind of how you put it to use. I would say like the things that you think about when you think about evaluation impact is pretty pictures, putting data into action, really kind of moving people. But if you don't have the setup right and don't have the infrastructure there, you won't do any of that. And I think as we were kind of putting this together, and I think as Mia really kind of thought through how to like make sure people had the steps in place, is you got to have the infrastructure, or you can't do a cost benefit analysis. You can't build a dashboard. You can't do all the things that are the pretty parts without kind of doing the hard parts. If you ever look through 4,000, statutes, it's a lot of work, but I think you learn a lot about how actually these systems work and kind of where all the information is. I think folks that are also more operational minded will also kind of help you as well to kind of attach both operational meaning to some of the policy work, because it's not disconnected. We don't kind of intend this to be kind of a researcher, go take the data and do stuff with it, but also it's actually a lot of richness in how systems actually work versus what kind of the data might say once you roll it all together. So I also think there's kind of hopefully kind of an innate collaboration that could take place between operations with researchers as well, because it's a great opportunity to kind of look at the real information, not just, again, that chart at the end, but actually like what goes into this, how complicated is this? You try and match up all these different statutes and think about how someone's case goes through a giant system like this. It's a lot. But I think this is also a way to kind of make sure everyone understands the same details, not just kind of looking at the end product. But again, I think this is the part that makes the other parts even possible. So this is why I kind of appreciate Mia's kind of dive into this to make sure folks do kind of have that basis.
Okay. Any final statements or questions? I am happy to give people's time back. I know that everyone is super busy. And so I just want to open it up for 10 more seconds to see if there's anybody out there that would like to comment or question anything. But again, don't feel like this is the end of the road for that. You can always shoot us an email, connect with us at any point, and we'll be able to help you along the way as well. Okay, seeing no hands, seeing no chat. Mia, I just want to say thank you again. I know you had quite the juggle today on PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets and walking through this, and so I'm really appreciative.
Thanks, everyone. We're really, really glad you're all here today, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.